The morning of June 8, 1966 dawned over Topeka, Kansas like any other late spring day. The sun rose bright and hot, promising another sweltering afternoon on the plains. The air was thick and heavy, a familiar kind of humidity that pressed down on the city like a damp blanket. People went about their business as they always did. Children rode their bicycles to school, fathers kissed their wives goodbye and headed to work at the state capitol or the Santa Fe rail yards. Mothers hung laundry on clotheslines and listened to the radio while they scrubbed floors. No one knew that by the end of the day, their lives would be torn apart by wind. By mid-morning, the weather began to change. The sky turned a strange shade of green, a color that old-timers in Kansas recognized as the telltale sign of trouble brewing. The winds shifted, picking up speed, and the temperature started to drop. Farmers watched their fields nervously. Cows huddled together in the corners of pastures. Dogs whined and scratched at doors. Something was coming, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. At the Topeka Weather Bureau office, meteorologists were watching a line of thunderstorms developing to the west, over the small towns of Linden and Osage City. The storms were growing fast, sucking moisture from the Gulf of Mexico and feeding on the intense heat of the Kansas plains. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the first tornado warning was issued. It was not for Topeka yet, but for the counties west of the city. People in Harvey and Marion counties were told to take cover. The warning went out over radio stations, and the civil defense sirens were tested in some towns. But in Topeka, life went on. One of the men watching the sky that day was a young meteorologist named Larry Wilson who worked for the Weather Bureau at the Topeka Municipal Airport. He had been tracking the storm all morning, noting the way the radar showed a hook echo forming, that characteristic shape that means a tornado is already on the ground. Wilson knew what that hook meant. He had seen it before. He picked up the phone and called the local radio stations, telling them to broadcast a tornado warning for Topeka immediately, but the radio stations were hesitant. They did not want to cause panic. They wanted confirmation. Meanwhile, the storm kept growing. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky over Topeka turned almost black. The wind began to howl and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees in just a few minutes. Hail started falling, first small stones like peas, then larger ones the size of golf balls. They pounded against windows, broke through skylights, dented the roofs of cars. People ran for cover. Children in schools were herded into hallways and told to sit against the walls with their heads down. Office workers in downtown buildings crowded into basements. Families in their homes opened their basement doors and waited, listening to the radio for the all-clear, but the all-clear never came. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the tornado touched down just west of the city, near the village of Pauline. It was a monster. The National Weather Service would later classify it as an F5, the highest category on the Fujita scale. Winds were estimated at over 200 miles per hour. The funnel was nearly a mile wide at its base, a dark, churning column that seemed to reach from the clouds all the way to the ground, touching the earth like a giant black finger. It was not a thin rope like some tornadoes. It was a massive wedge so wide that people who saw it said it looked like the whole sky was falling. The tornado moved east-northeast straight toward the heart of Topeka. It crossed the Kansas River, lifted the water, and threw it like a bucket of paint. It hit the Burnett Milling Company first, a massive grain elevator that stood 50 feet tall. The tornado ripped the elevator apart as if it were made of cardboard. Grain exploded into the air, turning the wind into a brown, choking cloud. Then the tornado plowed into a residential neighborhood, destroying house after house. The homes in its path did not just lose their roofs. They were completely flattened, their walls knocked down, their foundations scraped clean. Cars were thrown into the air and wrapped around telephone poles like pieces of ribbon. Trees were uprooted and hurled blocks away. In the Highland Park neighborhood, a woman named Evelyn Moore was home alone with her 2 young children. She heard the sirens, but she did not have a basement. She grabbed her children and pushed them into a closet under the stairs, covering them with pillows and blankets. She held them close and prayed. The noise was deafening, like a freight train roaring directly overhead, but deeper, more powerful, a bass rumble that shook the ground and vibrated through her bones. The walls of the house began to shake, and then she felt the floor lift. The whole house was moving. Windows shattered, the roof was torn off. Evelyn held her children tighter as the wind tried to pull them out of her arms. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The house was gone. She was sitting in the open air, surrounded by rubble, but she and her children were alive. The tornado continued its path of destruction. It struck the campus of Washburn University, where students had been taking exams inside the science hall. The building was new, built of reinforced concrete designed to withstand strong winds. But the tornado did not care. It ripped off the roof, tore down walls, and collapsed the entire structure in seconds. Miraculously, most of the students had taken cover in a basement corridor and they survived. But the building was a total loss. The tornado then moved on to the shopping district, taking out grocery stores, gas stations, and churches. It tore through the Oakland neighborhood, a working-class area of small frame houses. In some blocks, every single house was destroyed. Families who had lived there for generations lost everything. At the same time, the tornado was churning its way toward downtown Topeka, where the state capitol building stood. The capitol was a massive structure built of limestone, crowned with a dome that rose 300 feet above the city. The tornado hit the capitol directly. It ripped the copper sheeting off the dome, twisted the metal into spirals, and hurled chunks of stone into the streets below. Inside the building, state employees had taken refuge in the basement. They could hear the roar, feel the building shake, and they waited, certain that the walls would collapse around them. But the Capitol held. It was damaged badly, but it survived. The tornado did not care about symbols. It cared only about destruction. By the time the tornado finally lifted, around 3:20 in the afternoon, it had carved a path of devastation 22 miles long and half a mile wide. It had killed 16 people, injured over 400, and destroyed more than 800 homes. In a city of 120,000 people, nearly everyone knew someone who had been affected. The storm was over, but the nightmare was just beginning. The silence that followed the tornado was the most haunting thing, survivors would later say. The howling wind, the crashing glass, the roar of the funnel all stopped, and suddenly there was just quiet. Then the sounds of human suffering began to fill the void. People crying, calling for help, screaming for loved ones. The smell of natural gas filled the air, leaking from broken pipes. The sirens of fire trucks and ambulances whined throughout the city. It was the sound of a community in shock. One of the first responders to reach the Highland Park neighborhood was a volunteer firefighter named Bob Sanders. He had been at his job at a hardware store when he heard the tornado had touched down. He grabbed his gear and ran to his truck, driving straight into the storm. When he arrived at the neighborhood, he could not believe what he saw. Houses were gone, streets were blocked by debris. A car was wrapped around a tree 20 feet off the ground. A refrigerator sat in the middle of what used to be a living room, still intact. He started digging through rubble, pulling out survivors. He found a woman pinned under a beam, her leg broken but alive. He found a baby crying in a closet that was the only room still standing in a house that had been flattened. He worked for hours without stopping until his hands were bloody and his back ached. In the hours after the tornado, the people of Topeka did not wait for help. They helped each other. Neighbors dug through the ruins of other neighbors' homes, searching for anyone who might be trapped. Families opened their doors to strangers who had lost everything. The Red Cross set up emergency shelters in schools and churches. The National Guard was called in to establish a curfew and prevent looting, though there was little to loot. Everything was buried under piles of rubble. As night fell, the true scale of the disaster became clear. Entire blocks of the city were gone. In some places, there was nothing left but concrete slabs where houses used to stand. Trees were stripped of their bark, their branches bare like bones. Cars were crumpled and stacked on top of each other. The streets were covered in a layer of mud and shattered glass and splintered wood. And over it all hung a cloud of dust and smoke, lit by the headlights of emergency vehicles. The Topeka Tornado of 1966 was not the deadliest tornado in American history, but it was one of the most destructive in terms of property damage. At the time, it was the costliest tornado ever recorded, causing over $100 million in damage. That is about $800 million in today's money. But numbers do not capture what it meant to the people who lived through it. The tornado did not just destroy buildings. It shattered a sense of safety. It took away homes, businesses, churches, schools, and lives. It left a scar on the city that would never fully heal. Among the survivors was a 12-year-old boy named Michael who lived with his family in the Oakland neighborhood. When the tornado hit, he was in his bedroom doing homework. His mother screamed for him to get in the basement. He ran down the stairs, barely reaching the bottom before the roof of his house was torn off. He heard the wind, felt the pressure change, and then felt the entire house shift on its foundation. When the storm passed, he climbed out of the basement through a pile of debris. His house was gone, his school was gone, the grocery store where he bought candy was gone. He stood in the middle of the street surrounded by destruction and he did not recognize anything. His whole world had been erased in less than a minute. That night, his family slept in a shelter set up at a local church. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs. His mother cried quietly in the corner. His father stared at the wall, not speaking. Michael did not cry. He was too stunned to cry. He just sat there thinking about his baseball glove, which was buried somewhere under the rubble. He thought about his dog, who had run away during the storm and had not come back. He thought about his best friend Tommy, whose house had also been destroyed. He wondered if Tommy was okay. He did not know until the next morning when Tommy walked into the shelter, covered in mud but alive. The two boys hugged and did not let go for a long time. The days that followed were a blur of cleanup and recovery. Volunteers came from all over Kansas to help. The Salvation Army set up mobile kitchens, serving sandwiches and coffee to survivors and workers. The city government established a temporary headquarters in a bank building that had survived the storm. The governor of Kansas, William Avery, declared the entire city a disaster area, freeing up federal aid. President Lyndon Johnson called the governor and promised support. The nation watched as the small city of Topeka struggled to its feet. And through it all, the people of Topeka refused to give up. They had lost their homes, their possessions, and in some cases, their loved ones. But they had not lost their spirit. Neighbors helped neighbors, strangers helped strangers. A community that had been torn apart by wind came together with a strength that surprised even them. But that is a story for later. For now, we are still in the immediate aftermath of the storm in the dark hours of June 8, 1966, when the city was just beginning to understand what it had lost. The sirens had stopped, the wind had died, and the people of Topeka were left to pick up the pieces. The cleanup began before the sun rose on June 9th. By 4 in the morning, the streets of Topeka were already filled with the sounds of shovels scraping against concrete, the rumble of bulldozers, and the crackling of two-way radios. The city had no power, no running water in many areas, and no telephone service. But it had people, thousands of them. They came from every corner of the city, carrying tools, wearing work gloves, and bringing whatever food and water they could spare. They formed human chains, passing debris from hand to hand. They dug through wreckage with their bare hands when they had to. They worked in silence mostly, except for the occasional shout when someone found a survivor, or more often when someone found a body. The National Guard set up checkpoints at the edges of the devastated neighborhoods, keeping out the curious and the looters, but they let in anyone who wanted to help. By mid-morning, the streets were clogged with trucks, jeeps, and cars. The Red Cross had set up a command center at the municipal auditorium, which had survived the storm with only minor damage. From there, they coordinated the distribution of food, blankets, and medical supplies. Doctors and nurses from across the state arrived to set up field hospitals in schools and churches. The wounded were treated in makeshift operating rooms with no electricity and only flashlights for light. Surgeons performed amputations by the glow of headlights from parked cars. One of those surgeons was Dr. Henry McAllister, a 62-year-old veteran of World War II who had seen combat in the Pacific. He had retired from practice 5 years earlier, but when he heard the news, he drove to the nearest hospital, or what was left of it. The hospital had lost its roof and most of its windows, but the emergency room was still operational. Dr. McAllister worked for 36 hours straight, stitching wounds, setting broken bones, and comforting the dying. He later said that the only thing that kept him going was the look in the eyes of the patients. They were scared, but they trusted him. They believed that someone would take care of them. That belief, he said, was the most powerful medicine of all. In the Highland Park neighborhood, a group of volunteers discovered a family of 5 who had survived by huddling in a bathtub. The bathtub had been ripped from the floor and thrown into the yard, but the family was alive, covered in bruises and cuts, but alive. The volunteers carried them to a waiting ambulance, then went back to digging. They found a dog, a small terrier, hiding under an overturned couch. The dog was trembling but unharmed. Someone put a leash on it and led it to a temporary animal shelter set up at a pet store that had somehow been spared. The dog's owners were later found at a church shelter. The reunion was tearful and joyful, a small moment of light in the darkness. The city's water system had been severely damaged. The main water treatment plant was knocked out and many pipes were broken. The National Guard brought in water trucks and residents lined up with buckets, pots, and any container they could find. The water was rationed, 1 gallon per person per day. It was not enough for drinking and cooking, let alone bathing. The smell of sweat and dust and blood hung over the city. People did not care. They had more important things to worry about. By the end of the first full day after the tornado, the death toll had risen to 16. The search for survivors continued, but hope was fading. Rescue workers knew that anyone still trapped in the rubble was unlikely to have survived, yet they kept digging. They owed it to the families, they said. They owed it to the dead. The stories of survival began to emerge. A grandfather who had been buried under his house for 12 hours, kept alive by an air pocket and a bottle of water that had fallen into the hole with him. A young girl who had been thrown 2 blocks and landed in a tree, suffering only a broken arm. A man who had taken shelter in his car, only to have the car rolled over 3 times before coming to rest upside down in a ditch. He walked away with a concussion and a deep sense of gratitude. But there were also stories of loss. A woman who lost her husband and her 2 children in the same instant. She had been at work when the tornado hit, and she rushed home to find nothing but a pile of splintered wood. She sat on the curb for hours, staring at the ruins, refusing to leave. A neighbor finally convinced her to go to the shelter, but she returned every day for a week, hoping to find something, anything, that belonged to her family. The city's schools were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. One elementary school in the path of the tornado had its roof peeled off like a can of sardines. Desks and chairs were scattered across the playground. Textbooks were found 3 blocks away, pages torn out, covers soaked in mud. The teachers gathered what they could, salvaging a handful of books, a few maps, and a globe that had somehow survived. They vowed to reopen school somewhere, anywhere by the fall. They did. They held classes in church basements and community centers for the next 2 years until a new school could be built. The churches themselves were heavily damaged. St. Mary's Catholic Church lost its steeple and most of its stained glass windows. The pastor, Father Thomas O'Brien, was in the rectory when the tornado struck. He threw himself into a closet and prayed. When the storm passed, he emerged to find his church open to the sky. The altar was still standing, covered in debris but intact. He gathered the parishioners who had come to help, and they held Mass right there in the open air among the ruins. He preached about hope, about faith, about rebuilding. His voice carried over the rubble and people wept. The business district was a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered glass. The Sears Roebuck store, a landmark in downtown Topeka, was completely destroyed. Its steel beams were bent into impossible shapes. The jewelry store next door was gone, its inventory scattered across the street. A gas station at the corner of 10th and Kansas Avenue had exploded when a spark ignited leaking fuel. The fire burned for hours, consuming what little remained. The only thing left was a concrete slab and a charred sign that read, "We have gas." The city's infrastructure took years to rebuild. The water system was repaired within 6 months, but the roads took longer. The tornado had ripped up asphalt and concrete, exposing the earth beneath. In some places, the wind had scoured the ground so deeply that the original soil was visible for the first time in a century. The city planted trees along the damaged streets, but they were small and thin, a stark contrast to the ancient oaks and elms that had lined the avenues before the storm. The psychological impact was profound. Children who had lived through the tornado suffered nightmares for years. They would wake up screaming, convinced they heard the roar of the wind again. Adults found themselves jumping at sudden noises, the sound of a truck backfiring or a door slamming. The fear was always there, just beneath the surface. Some people moved away, unable to face the memories. Others stayed, determined to reclaim their lives. One of those who stayed was a woman named Helen. She had lost her house, her car, and her job when the factory where she worked was destroyed. She had no family in Topeka, no savings, no plans, but she had a stubborn streak. She moved into a FEMA trailer, a tiny metal box with no air conditioning and thin walls. She worked at a temporary job sorting donations at the Red Cross warehouse. She saved every penny. 2 years later, she bought a small house on the north side of town, not far from where her old house had stood. She planted a garden, grew tomatoes and roses, and told her neighbors that the tornado had taken everything but her will to live. The city government launched an ambitious rebuilding plan. The mayor, Charles Wright, gave a speech at the city council meeting a week after the storm. He stood at a podium that had been salvaged from the wreckage of City Hall. He said that Topeka would not just rebuild, it would rebuild better. The new buildings would be stronger, built to withstand winds of up to 200 miles per hour. The storm drains would be improved to prevent flooding. The power lines would be buried underground. He promised that the tornado would not define the city would define itself. Over the next few years, Topeka rose from the rubble. The Capitol Dome was repaired, its copper sheeting replaced, its limestone cleaned and reinforced. The shopping district was rebuilt with modern storefronts and wider sidewalks. The Oakland neighborhood was transformed with new houses that were sturdier and more weather-resistant. The schools were rebuilt and the churches were restored. The scars were still there, but they were covered over like a wound that had healed into a scar. The tornado of 1966 became a part of Topeka's identity, a shared memory that bound the community together. Every year on June 8th, the city held a memorial service. Survivors gathered at the site of the old Highland Park neighborhood, now a park, and they told their stories. The children who had lived through the storm grew up and had children of their own. They told their children about the day the sky turned green, about the roar like 1,000 trains, about the silence that followed. The children listened and they learned. The lessons were not just about weather. They were about resilience, about community, about the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. The tornado had stripped away everything superficial and exposed the core of what mattered: family, friendship, faith. The people of Topeka learned that they could lose their homes, their possessions, their jobs, but they could not lose each other. As long as they had each other, they could rebuild anything. Decades later, the tornado is still remembered. Meteorologists study it to understand how tornadoes form and how they can be predicted. Historians write about it as a turning point in disaster response, the first time that federal aid was deployed so quickly and effectively. But for the people who lived through it, it is not a historical event. It is a personal one. It is the day they lost everything and found everything that mattered. The Topeka tornado of 1966 was a storm of incredible power, but the spirit of the people who faced it was even stronger. That spirit lives on in the city today, in the way neighbors still help each other, in the way the community comes together in times of crisis, in the way that the past is honored without being allowed to control the future. The tornado is a memory now, a story told to children and grandchildren. But its legacy is real. It is a legacy of courage, of hope, of the unbreakable bond between people who refuse to give up. And so, as the sun set on that first terrible day and the stars came out over the ruined city, the people of Topeka did what they had always done. They looked up at the sky and they began to rebuild. One brick at a time, one life at a time, one prayer at a time. They would not be defeated. They would not be broken. They would rise. The cleanup continued for weeks. The debris was hauled away in trucks, loaded onto trains, and taken to landfills outside the city. The wreckage of homes and businesses was sorted, searched for anything of value, and then discarded. The city's landfill grew into a mountain of twisted metal, shattered glass, and splintered wood. It was a monument to the storm, a physical reminder of what had been lost. But the people did not dwell on the loss. They focused on the future. The Red Cross distributed seeds and gardening tools, encouraging families to plant gardens in their yards. The Salvation Army organized clothing drives and furniture donations. The churches held bake sales and car washes to raise money for families in need. The community was alive with activity, a hive of purpose and determination. The children especially were resilient. They played in the ruins, turning piles of rubble into forts and mountains. They found treasures, a doll with one eye, a baseball that had been smashed flat, a medal from the war. They made up games, pretending that the tornado was a monster that they had defeated. They laughed and ran and screamed with joy, a sound that brought tears to the eyes of the adults who heard it. The children were the proof that life would go on. As long as they kept laughing, the city would survive. One of those children, Michael, grew up to become a meteorologist. He never forgot the tornado. He studied it, analyzed its path, its intensity, its behavior. He dedicated his career to understanding storms, to warning people, to saving lives. He wrote papers on the Topeka tornado, giving presentations to weather conferences around the world. But every year on June 8th, he went back to the site of his old house, stood on the corner where his childhood home had once stood, and he remembered. He remembered the roar. He remembered the silence. He remembered the hand of his mother pulling him down the stairs. And he remembered the kindness of strangers, the people who had helped his family when they had nothing. The Topeka tornado of 1966 was a tragedy, but it was also a testament to the human spirit. It showed that even in the darkest moments there is light, even in the most devastating losses there is hope, and even in the most violent storms there is a calm, a stillness, a chance to begin again. That is the story of the Topeka tornado. It is a story of wind and destruction, but it is also a story of people and resilience. It is a story that will never be forgotten, not as long as the city stands, not as long as the survivors live, and not as long as the children of those survivors tell their children about the day the sky turned green and the world changed forever. And the world did change forever, not just for the families who lost homes, but for the entire field of meteorology. The Topeka tornado became a case study, a reference point for how storms form and how warnings can be improved. In the years that followed, the National Weather Service implemented new protocols based on what they learned from June 8, 1966. The concept of a tornado emergency was born from the chaos of that afternoon. The idea that a tornado could be so large, so powerful, and so unpredictable forced scientists to rethink their assumptions. They began to use radar more aggressively, tracking storms in real time, issuing alerts earlier. The technology was still crude, but the lessons were clear. The sky could not be trusted. In Topeka, the rebuilding continued with a rhythm that became familiar. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air from dawn until dusk. The streets were lined with construction trucks and trailers. The hardware stores sold out of lumber and nails and roofing shingles. The economy, which had been shattered, began to stir back to life. Contractors from other cities came to help, and they stayed. They opened businesses, they bought houses, they became part of the community. The tornado had scattered the population, but it also brought new people in. The city grew in unexpected ways. One of the most remarkable stories of the recovery was the rebuilding of the churches. Many of the older congregations had lost their sanctuaries completely. The walls were gone, the pews were splintered, the stained glass windows were scattered across the blocks. But the congregations did not dissolve. They met in basements, in school gymnasiums, in the homes of members. They held services outdoors under the open sky, praying for strength and giving thanks for survival. The first church to be rebuilt was the First Methodist Church on the south side of town. The cornerstone was laid exactly 1 year after the storm. The pastor, a man named Reverend Thomas, gave a sermon that day. He said that the church had been destroyed, but the faith had not. The walls were gone, but the spirit remained. The congregation wept and cheered and sang hymns that echoed across the empty lots. The schools also came back slowly. The Highland Park High School had been reduced to rubble. The students were scattered to other schools, doubling up in classrooms, sharing textbooks. The teachers worked without pay for the first month, donating their time because they believed in the value of education. When the new school was built, it was modern and strong, with reinforced concrete and a safe room in the basement. The students called it the castle because it looked like it could withstand anything. And it did. Years later, when another storm threatened, the school was used as a shelter. Hundreds of people crowded into its halls and they felt safe. That was the legacy of the tornado: safety, preparation, a refusal to be caught unaware again. The mental health of the survivors became a focus of long-term care. The Red Cross and local hospitals set up counseling centers. Psychiatrists and social workers came to Topeka to study the effects of trauma. They found that many survivors experienced nightmares, anxiety, and a persistent sense of dread. The sound of wind, even a gentle breeze, could trigger panic. The sight of dark clouds could send people running for cover. Some people developed what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, but in 1966 the term was not widely used. People just called it nerves. They coped in different ways. Some buried themselves in work. Some turned to alcohol or religion. Some found solace in talking to each other, sharing their stories over coffee, forming support groups that met in community centers and church basements. One group, called the Tornado Survivors Circle, met every Wednesday night for nearly a decade. They sat in a circle of folding chairs in the basement of the public library. They told their stories again and again. They talked about the people they had lost, the homes they had loved, the moment they thought they were going to die. They wept and laughed and held each other's hands. The group was not led by a therapist, just a volunteer who had also survived. It was a place where they could be honest, where they could say out loud what they felt without judgment. Many of them said it saved their lives. It gave them a reason to keep going, a community within a community. The children who survived grew up with a unique perspective. They knew that safety was an illusion. They knew that the world could change in an instant. Some of them became cautious, even fearful as adults. They avoided storms, they built basements, they kept emergency kits. Others became reckless, as if they had already faced the worst and nothing else could scare them. A few became storm chasers, drawn to the power of the wind, wanting to understand what they had witnessed. One of them, a young man named David, became a photographer. He traveled the Great Plains, capturing images of tornadoes, selling them to magazines and documentaries. He said he was chasing the ghost of 1966. He wanted to see the beauty in the beast, to find something meaningful in the destruction. The economic impact of the tornado rippled for years. The total damage was estimated at $100 million in 1966, which would be nearly $800 million today. But the cost went beyond the physical. Businesses closed or moved away. The tax base shrank. The city had to borrow money to rebuild infrastructure. Property values in some neighborhoods never fully recovered, but other neighborhoods thrived. The areas that were rebuilt with better materials and modern designs attracted new residents. The city learned to diversify its economy, not relying solely on manufacturing and agriculture. It invested in education and healthcare. The tornado had been a crisis, but it also became a catalyst for change. In the decades since, the Topeka tornado has been the subject of books, documentaries, and academic papers. It has been compared to other legendary storms, such as the Tri-State Tornado of 1925 and the Joplin Tornado of 2001. But for Kansans, it remains the benchmark. Every June, the local television stations run retrospectives. They show old footage, the grainy black and white film of the wreckage, the interviews with survivors, the images of the empty sky where a neighborhood used to be. The younger generation watches these stories with a mix of fascination and horror. They cannot imagine what it was like. They hope they never have to, but the memory is kept alive in more than just media. The city has a museum dedicated to the tornado, a small building near the Capitol. Inside, there are photographs, pieces of debris, and a reconstructed timeline. There is a piece of the old Highland Park School, a twisted chunk of steel. There is a doll that was found miles away from its home, its dress torn, its face cracked. There is a recording of the emergency broadcast, the voice of the announcer cracking as he reads the list of damaged areas. Visitors walk through the museum in silence, reading the stories, looking at the faces of the victims. Many leave in tears. They leave with a new respect for the power of nature and the strength of ordinary people. One of the most powerful exhibits is a wall of photographs. Each photograph shows a survivor holding a picture of themselves taken shortly after the tornado. The contrast is striking. In the old photos, they are dirty, tired, dazed. In the new photos, they are older, grayer, but smiling. They have rebuilt their lives. They have found joy again. The wall is called the Unbroken. It is a tribute to the resilience that defines Topeka. The tornado also changed the way that the state of Kansas prepares for disasters. Before 1966, there was no statewide tornado drill. Now every spring, sirens are tested and schools practice taking cover. The warning systems have improved with better radar, more frequent updates, and a network of storm spotters. The National Weather Service office in Topeka is one of the busiest in the country, issuing dozens of warnings each year. The meteorologists there know the history. They study the 1966 storm. They use it as a reference point. They tell new hires this is what can happen. This is why we do what we do. For the survivors, the storm never really ends. It lives in their bodies, in their dreams, in the way they flinch when the wind picks up. But they also carry something else. A pride. They made it through the worst. They lost everything and still found a way to keep going. That pride is passed down to their children and grandchildren. They tell their stories not to frighten but to inspire. They say, we lived through it. You can live through anything. And the stories keep evolving. New details emerge, new connections are made. A woman in California finds a box of letters from her grandmother who lived in Topeka during the storm. The letters describe the panic, the chaos, the smell of wet plaster. She donates them to the museum. A man in Texas who was a child in 1966 writes a memoir. He remembers watching his father rebuild their house, hammer in hand, sweat on his brow. He remembers the day his father finished the roof, how he stood on top of it and waved at the neighbors. The memoir becomes a bestseller. The tornado enters the national conversation again. In 2016, on the 50th anniversary, the city held a large commemoration. Survivors were invited back. Some had not been to Topeka in decades. They walked through the streets, pointing at buildings that did not exist when they left. They visited the cemetery where friends and family were buried. They attended a ceremony at the Capitol where the governor spoke. He talked about the strength of the community, the power of faith, the importance of remembering. He read the names of the 17 who died. The audience stood in silence. The wind blew gently. It was a warm June day, bright and clear, not a cloud in the sky, and yet for those who had been there, the day was bittersweet. The sun felt heavy, the air felt thick. They remembered the green sky. They remembered the roar. They remembered the hand of a stranger pulling them from the rubble. They remembered the silence that followed the sound of nothing. And they remembered the sound of life returning, the birds singing, the children laughing, the hammers striking nails. The tornado took many things, but it could not take the sound of hope. So the story of the Topeka Tornado of 1966 is not just a story of disaster. It is a story of what it means to be human. It is a story of facing the unimaginable and finding the strength to stand again. It is a story of a city that was broken and rebuilt, not just with bricks and mortar, but with love and courage. It is a story that continues to be written every time a survivor tells their tale, every time a child asks what happened, every time a meteorologist studies the data. The storm is over. The wind has long since died. But the memory remains, alive and powerful, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, there is always a way forward. And that way is paved by the people who refuse to give up. And that way is paved by the people who refuse to give up. But what does that resilience look like in the quiet moments, the ones that never make the news? It looks like a woman named Evelyn who lost her house and her husband on the same day. She was 34 years old with 3 children to raise and no savings. She moved into a temporary trailer provided by the Red Cross and she cried every night for a month. Then one morning she woke up and decided she was done crying. She got a job at the post office sorting mail by hand. She saved every penny she could, and 2 years later she bought a small house on the edge of town. It was nothing fancy, but it was hers. She planted roses in the front yard, the same kind her husband had given her on their anniversary. She told her children that the tornado had taken their father, but it had not taken their future. She lived to be 91 and she never missed a single anniversary of the storm. She would sit on her porch on June 8th, look at the sky, and whisper, "Thank you. Thank you for the chance to start over." Stories like Evelyn's are not unusual in Topeka. They are the rule, not the exception. The city became a laboratory for human endurance. Psychologists from the University of Kansas came to study the survivors to understand how ordinary people cope with extraordinary trauma. They found patterns. Those who rebuilt their social networks quickly, who reconnected with neighbors and friends, fared better than those who isolated themselves. The ones who volunteered to help others even when they themselves had lost everything recovered faster. Altruism was a medicine. The act of giving, of showing up with a hammer or a casserole, healed the giver as much as the receiver. The psychologists wrote papers that were read around the world. They called it the Topeka model. It became a blueprint for disaster response in other countries, from earthquakes in Japan to hurricanes in the Caribbean. But the lessons went deeper than psychology. The tornado changed the way architects thought about buildings. Before 1966, many homes in the Midwest were built with little regard for wind resistance. After the storm, new codes required stronger foundations, reinforced walls, and secure roof connections. Builders started using hurricane straps and impact-resistant windows. The cost of construction went up, but so did safety. The city also redesigned its public schools. Every new school built after 1966 included a storm shelter, a windowless room in the core of the building, reinforced with concrete. Students today practice tornado drills in those rooms, sitting with their heads down, listening to the sirens. They do not know that those rooms were born from tragedy. They just know that when the alarm sounds, they go to the safe place. The tornado also left its mark on the medical community. The storm had overwhelmed the local hospitals. The emergency rooms were flooded with the injured, and doctors had to triage on the lawn using flashlights and sheer will. In the aftermath, the city built a new trauma center, one of the first in the nation designed specifically for mass casualty events. It had a dedicated helipad, a backup generator, and a communication system that could coordinate with multiple agencies. That center became a model for other cities. When the Oklahoma City bombing happened in 1995, the doctors in Topeka were ready. They had learned from 1966. The tornado also transformed the local media. Before the storm, television news in Topeka was a sleepy affair. There was one station, WIBW, and its reporters mostly covered county fairs and city council meetings. But on June 8th, they became the voice of the city. They stayed on the air for 36 hours straight, reading names of the missing, broadcasting emergency instructions, providing a lifeline of information. The news director, a man named Jack, later said it was the most important work of his life. He realized that the media could be more than entertainment. It could be a tool for survival. After that, he pushed for better weather equipment, for more training, for a commitment to public service. His station eventually became one of the most respected in the region, known for its severe weather coverage. Today, when a storm approaches Topeka, the anchors do not cut to commercials. They stay on the air until the danger passes. They are carrying on the tradition Jack started. The storm also had a profound effect on the religious landscape. Topeka was already a religious city, with dozens of churches dotting the landscape. But after the tornado, faith took on new meaning. People who had never prayed before found themselves on their knees. Churches became shelters not just for the body but for the soul. Priests and ministers and rabbis walked through the rubble, offering comfort, asking for nothing. One pastor, a young man named Thomas, lost his own church in the storm. The roof collapsed, the pews were scattered, the stained glass windows shattered. He stood in the ruins and wept. Then he gathered his congregation in a parking lot and held services under the open sky. He preached about rebuilding, about faith in the midst of chaos. His sermon that day was recorded on a cassette tape and it circulated for years. It was called "The Wind Cannot Break What God Has Joined." Years later, the church was rebuilt, bigger and stronger than before. The congregation doubled in size. People came not because they were afraid, but because they had seen what faith could do. But not everyone found comfort in faith. Some survivors lost their belief. They could not reconcile a loving God with a storm that killed children. They walked away from religion and they never went back. The tornado created atheists as well as believers. It forced everyone to confront the big questions, the ones that have no easy answers. Why did this happen? Why did some live and others die? What is the meaning of suffering? The survivors carried those questions with them like stones in their pockets. Some found answers in philosophy, in nature, in the simple act of living. Others never found answers at all. They simply learned to live with the questions. The storm also changed the way people viewed the natural world. Before 1966, many Kansans took the sky for granted. It was just the sky, blue or gray, nothing special. After the tornado, they watched the clouds with a new intensity. They learned to read the signs, the eerie stillness, the green tint, the sudden drop in temperature. They became amateur meteorologists, scanning the horizon, sharing observations. The storm had given them a kind of knowledge that could not be taught in classrooms. It was a knowledge born of fear and respect. That knowledge was passed down through generations. Grandparents told their grandchildren about the day the sky turned black. They described the sound, the feeling, the aftermath. They showed them where to go if a storm came, which corners of the basement were safest, how to cover their heads. The stories became rituals repeated every spring. They were not meant to scare but to prepare. They were a kind of inheritance, a gift of wisdom bought at a terrible price. And the land itself remembered. The soil in the hardest-hit neighborhoods was never the same. It had been churned and mixed with debris, with glass and metal and ash. For years after, farmers who tilled nearby fields would plow up fragments of the past, a child's shoe, a piece of a wedding ring, a shard of a plate. They would pick them up, shake off the dirt, and wonder about the hands that had once held them. Some of those fragments ended up in the museum. Others were buried again, returned to the earth as if to say, let the past rest. But the past does not rest easily in Topeka. Every June, the memories rise again like the heat from the pavement. The city holds a moment of silence at 6:30 in the evening, the exact time the tornado touched down. The sirens are not tested on that day. The air is quiet. People stop what they are doing and stand still. In the grocery store, the cashiers pause. In the offices, the typing stops. On the playgrounds, the children look up, confused by the sudden stillness. For 1 minute, the entire city holds its breath, then life resumes. The moment is brief, but it is powerful. It is a way of saying, we remember, we will always remember. As the decades passed, the survivors aged, their numbers dwindled. By the 70th anniversary in 2036, only a few dozen were left, most of them in their 80s and 90s. They came to the commemoration in wheelchairs, pushed by their children and grandchildren. They sat in the front row, their eyes cloudy, their hands trembling. They listened as the mayor spoke, as the names were read, as a choir sang Amazing Grace. When it was over, they were invited to share their stories. One by one, they stood up or were helped to stand. They spoke in voices that were thin and cracked but still clear. They talked about the things they had never forgotten, the color of the sky, the smell of gas, the sound of a child crying in the dark. They talked about the strangers who became friends, the neighbors who became family. They talked about the day they learned what really mattered. The youngest survivor that day was a woman named Marie. She had been 4 years old in 1966. Her mother had thrown her into a bathtub and covered her with a mattress. Marie remembered nothing of the tornado itself, only the aftermath. She remembered the bright light of a television camera, the feeling of being carried, the presence of a man in a uniform who gave her a piece of candy. She had grown up with the story, heard it so many times that it felt like her own memory. She had spent her life trying to understand what her mother went through. She became a historian specializing in natural disasters. She wrote a book about the Topeka tornado, interviewing hundreds of survivors. The book was called The Green Sky. It won awards. It was taught in schools. Marie said that writing the book was her way of paying back the debt she owed to the people who saved her. She never met the man in the uniform, but she hoped he knew that his piece of candy had meant something. It had meant that the world was still kind. The legacy of the Topeka tornado is not just in the buildings that were rebuilt or the laws that were changed. It is in the way that people treat each other. The storm created a culture of neighborliness that persists to this day. When a family in Topeka loses their home to a fire or a flood, the community mobilizes. They bring food, they offer shelter, they raise money. They do not wait to be asked. They remember 1966. They remember what it felt like to be alone in the rubble, and they do not want anyone else to feel that way. It is a quiet legacy, one that does not make headlines, but it is real. It is felt in every potluck dinner, every fundraiser, every volunteer who shows up with a paintbrush. And the winds have not stopped. There have been other tornadoes in Kansas, some of them just as powerful. The state has seen F5 storms in Greensburg and Andover, in Udall and Heston. Each one brought its own tragedy, its own stories of loss and survival. But none has quite matched the cultural impact of the 1966 Topeka tornado. That storm was the first to be broadcast live on television, the first to be studied in such detail, the first to galvanize an entire region. It was a turning point. Before the storm, people thought of tornadoes as acts of God, random and unstoppable. After the storm, they began to see them as events that could be predicted, prepared for, survived. The storm did not just change Topeka. It changed the way the whole country thought about severe weather. The meteorologists who studied that storm became legends. Dr. Theodore Fujita himself visited Topeka, walking through the wreckage with a notebook and a camera. He measured the damage, interviewed witnesses, and used the data to refine his scale. The Topeka tornado was one of the first storms to be officially classified as F5 on the Fujita scale. That classification gave the storm a kind of immortality. It became the benchmark for all future F5s. When people asked what the worst possible tornado looked like, they pointed to Topeka. But the classification was more than a number. It was a warning. It told the world that even in a place that is used to storms, there could be one that defied all expectations. It reminded people that nature is not tame. It is wild and unpredictable and utterly indifferent to human plans. The only thing we can do is prepare, respond, and rebuild they did. The neighborhood of Burnett's Mound, where the tornado first touched down, was eventually redeveloped. The hill itself was leveled in some places, reshaped in others. A new housing development went up with wider streets and stricter building codes. The developers planted trees that were less likely to uproot. They installed storm drains that could handle more water. They even built a small park at the center with a playground and a memorial bench. The bench had a plaque that read, "This land remembers the wind, so do we." The park became a place of quiet reflection. People came to sit, to think, to watch the clouds. They brought their children and told them the story. They pointed to the horizon and said, "See that line of trees? That is where the tornado passed." They spoke in calm, measured tones as if they were describing a historical battle. In a way, they were. The tornado was a battle, a fight between the sky and the ground had won not because it was stronger, but because the people who lived on it refused to surrender. And that is the final lesson of the Topeka Tornado of 1966. It is not a lesson about destruction, but about creation. It is about the ability of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when they are pushed to the edge. It is about finding grace in the ruins, hope in the aftermath, and love in the hearts of strangers. The wind came and went, but the people stayed. They stayed and they built and they lived. And that is the story that will be told for as long as there are ears to hear it. When the last survivor is gone, when the last memory fades, the story will remain. It will live in the museums and the documentaries, in the whispered warnings of parents to their children, in the quiet pride of a city that looked into the abyss and did not blink. The storm is over, the wind has stopped, but the spirit of Topeka will never be silenced. And yet, even as the spirit of Topeka remains unshaken, the city itself has continued to evolve. The skyline changed over the decades. Old buildings came down, new ones rose in their place. The Washburn campus was rebuilt, stronger than before, with a modern library and a state-of-the-art science center. The neighborhood around Burnett's Mound became one of the most desirable in the city, not in spite of its history, but because of it. People wanted to live there, to feel connected to something larger than themselves. They planted gardens, painted fences, and raised families. They knew the story of the tornado, and they passed it down like an heirloom, polished and precious. The children of the survivors grew up with a strange kind of inheritance. They carried the memory of something they had not experienced, but they felt it in the way their parents flinched at a sudden crack of thunder, the way they checked the sky before every picnic, the way they kept a flashlight and a radio in the hallway closet at all times. The children learned to read the weather the way their grandparents had taught their parents. They knew the difference between a watch and a warning. They knew that a green sky meant trouble. They knew the safest room in the house was the basement, and if there was no basement, the bathtub with a mattress on top. By the early 21st century, the technology had advanced beyond anything the meteorologists of 1966 could have imagined. Doppler radar could see a tornado forming before it touched the ground. Smartphones broadcast warnings instantly to millions of people. Storm chasers in armored vehicles drove directly into the path of the funnel, filming every second in high definition. Yet for all that progress, the people of Topeka still paid attention to the sirens. They still respected the power of the wind. They knew that no amount of technology could stop a tornado, only help you get out of its way. The tornado of 1966 also left its mark on the way scientists think about community resilience. Researchers from universities across the country came to Topeka to study the social networks that had formed in the aftermath. They interviewed survivors, analyzed the response times of emergency services, and mapped the flow of donations and volunteers. They found that the neighborhoods that recovered fastest were the ones where neighbors already knew each other, where churches and civic organizations were strong, where people trusted one another. That insight became part of disaster planning worldwide. Topeka became a case study, a living laboratory for how ordinary people can withstand the unimaginable. The museum downtown still hosts an exhibit dedicated to the tornado. It is not a large exhibit, just a single room with a looping video, a few pieces of twisted metal, and a timeline of photographs. But it is one of the most visited parts of the museum. School groups come through every week. The children press their faces against the glass, staring at the mangled stop sign that was bent into a spiral. They ask the same questions every time. Did anyone die? Yes, 16 people. Was it scary? Yes, very scary. Could it happen again? Yes, it could. Then the guide tells them the most important part of the story. The part about how the city came together, how strangers helped strangers, how people rebuilt their lives from nothing. The children listen with wide eyes, they do not forget. On the 80th anniversary in 2046, there was no one left who had been alive during the storm. The last survivor, Marie, had passed away 10 years earlier at the age of 88. The commemoration was still held, but it was different. The speakers were now the grandchildren of the survivors. They read from the letters and diaries their grandparents had left behind. They showed home movies that had been digitized, grainy black and white footage of debris being cleared, of families standing in front of their new houses, of a city slowly rising from its own ruins. The crowd that gathered that day was smaller than it had been in 2036, but it was no less determined. They stood in the same park on the same ground under the same wide Kansas sky. They listened to the wind rustling through the trees and they remembered. The story of the Topeka tornado is now part of the city's DNA. It is woven into its history, its culture, its very soul. Every time a siren sounds on a summer afternoon, every time the sky turns a sickly shade of green, the people of Topeka know what to do. They do not panic, they do not run. They move with calm purpose, guiding their children to safety, checking on their elderly neighbors, tuning in to the local news. They do this because they were taught by the generations before them and they will teach the generations to come. The storm is long gone, but its lessons endure. The wind has stopped, but the spirit of Topeka will never be silenced. It will echo through the ages, a quiet testament to the strength of ordinary people when they face the extraordinary. And that is how the story ends, not with destruction but with hope, not with loss, but with love, not with a period, but with a promise that as long as the city stands, it will remember.